AI this, AI that, AI will, AI won't. You should fear this. You should be really excited about this. The problem with artificial intelligence, I find as a journalist, is a lot of the time it's just words rather than things happening. Today, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer tried to change that by publishing a new strategy for AI in the UK, which comes with 50 different things that the government is going to do at various points of the next few years. So we're going to dig into that to find out what our AI future might actually mean for you and me fairly soon. We'll do that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And because we're going to be talking about the government's AI Opportunities Action Plan, that rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? We're joined by the BBC's AI correspondent, Marc Cieslak. Hello.
Hello.
Or maybe I should call you the government's AI strategies correspondent, because there's been quite a few of them, hasn't there? There was one of these about 2 and a bit years ago.
Yeah, and this is an entirely new one. It has entirely new plans in there. Well, some of the plans are new. The government commissioned this last summer, and there are 50 recommendations, and the government is going to be pushing ahead with every single one of them.
And we'll read out every single one in minute detail. Just kidding. We'll get Mark to give us the highlights. But first of all, Chris, just do the kind of the political framing of this, because you had the Prime Minister doing a classic technology speech with some robots behind him, but with some negative headlines hanging over him.
Yeah, all of which kind of framed around the economy broadly. So the Prime Minister in this speech was wanting to get across the sense that not only does he recognise the power and significance of artificial intelligence to revolutionise society and the economy and the delivery of public services, but he wants to really lean into that, to emphasise the opportunities, to acknowledge the risks and the downsides, but to emphasise the opportunities and argue that AI is going to happen, and is happening. So the UK should be a country that is in the lead around this sort of stuff, alongside the giants of America and China, and therefore can have a disproportionate economic benefit from it, so goes the theory, as opposed to importing stuff that other people have managed to sort of make and develop before us. So that's his kind of posture, his stance, if you like. And Mark will talk about this in far more detail, but speaking to the various experts around the room today, they talk about it as an industrial revolution. And the political journalist in me, because I'm no tech journalist, tells me that revolutions have winners and losers. They upend things. And so the medium to longer term challenge is going to be one of how society and how governments manage that revolution, which will bring positives and negatives, both to individuals and to society. And then there's the short-term challenge, which is where we were on Newscast last week, which is that the markets are charging the government more to borrow money at the moment. The economy is stagnant. And, the economy, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are so central to the whole Labour project of the 2020s. Be trusted on the economy again. Be seen to be delivering a better economic picture than what went before. Now, granted, they're only 6 months in, but the indicators at the moment look pretty bleak. And so that was the kind of short-term politics of the moment, which kind of overlapped with the whole question of AI.
And we'll talk about the questions around Rachel Reeves's future in a couple of minutes, because there was an interesting little interlude about that today. But going back to the main subject of AI, Mark, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with like the big picture and the strategic stuff here, or do you want to dive into some of these 50 recommendations?
Well, let's do so. I mean, some of the big picture stuff, some of the headlines, really, rather than every single one of the recommendations. The big headlines, the government saying that we're going to have things like a new supercomputer, which will help create, sort of raw computing power capabilities in the UK.
When people use that word compute, that's what they mean, is just the amount of computing you've got.
Yeah.
And that would be what, state-owned, taxpayer-funded, publicly owned supercomputer?
Well, details are very, very thin on the ground on this new supercomputer. There was going to be one from the previous government. That was cancelled. And now there's going to be a new supercomputer. But there's going to be a supercomputer at any rate. And then there's discussion around this idea of AI growth zones. These will appear at certain locations across the UK. They'll have enhanced access to the power grid because they'll need it, and there'll be streamlined things like planning permissions. Will be made a lot easier so that data centers can be built. Data centers are absolutely vital if you want to have an AI-filled future. And then the other big thing,
they've announced the prospects for one so far, haven't they?
yeah, there's a pilot. There's a pilot happening in Culham in Oxfordshire, and that site is quite unique, really, because it's the site of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. So they have a lot of infrastructure there that you won't find at lots of other places across the country. It's also unique because there's going to be a housing estate built right next to it. So the power that's generated for that, there'll be some excess power, which can then go into powering a data centre. This is the sort of stuff that you don't find everywhere in the country. Every single town and city doesn't have this kind of infrastructure there. Although there's discussion that in deindustrialized regions, in places where there might have been very big factories which are now closed, that the power demands of those factories were supplied by power stations. They're not going anywhere now. They might be able to be rerouted, reused for things like data centers. And then the final, one of the not the final, but one of the other things is energy. AI is incredibly power hungry. It uses a lot of energy. So there's going to be a new AI Energy Council. Ed Miliband is going to lead that, as well as the Science and Tech Secretary, Peter Kyle. And that's going to look at costs and solutions to dealing with the enormous power demands that we're going to see from AI. So that's some of the big ticket headlines. But the plan itself is really, really broad. It touches on absolutely everything, really. It touches on healthcare, it touches on education, it touches on employment. And that's where perhaps some of the problem lies, that it is such a big, broad, sweeping plan, trying to deal with a lot of things all at once. And now, obviously, these things are going to happen over a very, very long time. But it's a big ask. There's a lot of stuff in there.
And a lot of the actual things that have been announced today are plans to have plans at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some things are quite thin on detail. Some things are quite so thin on detail. A good example is that companies like Google DeepMind. DeepMind is the third biggest AI company in the world, probably. It's in the upper echelons of AI companies. It was born in the UK. It was a UK company. But it was purchased by Google in 2014. Now it's at the absolute tip of the spear, the forefront of all of Google's AI research now, and it's worth an awful lot of money. Now, when I spoke to Peter Kyle about this, he was saying, well, we want to grow more what they call sovereign AI, more domestic or homegrown AI companies like that, and keep them in the UK. Now, that's really, really hard to do for a very simple reason, and that is money and investment and cash. And we don't really have too much of a problem with innovation. We don't have too much of a problem with the minds that come up with this innovation. There's an incredible amount of talent. But when it comes to creating companies on that kind of scale, all of those companies live in Silicon Valley. All those companies live in the United States. Very few of them live in the UK, and very few of them are still UK owned. In fact, almost none of them are still UK owned. So when the government says it wants to build these kind of companies, or wants to invest or encourage investment in these kind of companies, the sheer volumes of money that are required to do that are more than eye-watering. We're talking incredible amounts of cash, and the harsh reality of it is, where is that cash coming from? The suggestions of pension funds might pay for it, but pension funds are very, very cautious with what they invest in. Tech investments, startup investments, AI investments, these are very risky things.
I mean, Chris, though, you can see why a prime minister who's been accused of talking the country down, and that doomsterism actually having an effect on the economy, which lots of people theorise has happened, you can see why he'd want to buy into this stuff.
Yeah, totally that, completely that. Because, if something is happening anyway and happening all around you, which in the case of artificial intelligence it is, then, it's not a yes or no. It's to what extent you sort of lean in or not. And he can and tried to sound upbeat and optimistic and positive about AI when clearly it could have massive transformational benefits, but also massive economic challenges, at least for some. It could just upend all sorts of things in a positive and a negative way. So whilst he wouldn't want to be seen to, nor indulge in describing what he was doing as sort of boosterish, that phrase that was so often associated with Boris Johnson, governments do help shape sentiments and mood, and critics say that their gloominess of the first 6 months helped talk things down. I think today you did see a bit of them trying to lean into the optimistic rather than the pessimistic, because perhaps what's gone on in the last 6 months has contributed to a bit of that, as well as the potential, albeit not by a week on Wednesday, that AI can be transformatory in terms of the delivery of public services and doing more for less, which every government likes to hope it can do, but it's actually quite difficult, and indeed more widely in the economy when it comes to productivity, etc., in that sort of pursuit for the currently much missed economic growth.
And we will zoom in on the implications of AI for the NHS in the second half of this episode. But Mark, just before you go, because we're going to dash off to something, you talked about data centres. A lot of this document is about what the data that's going to be in those centres and whether it's going to be public sector, government-owned data from the NHS, any other bit of the public sector. What's going on there?
Interestingly, talking to people in tech companies, talking to people a few people from AI companies whose advice has ended up in this report, there's a big feeling that governments and governments in the past haven't really appreciated and really understood the value of the UK's data, the amount of data that exists in the public sphere in the UK, because the UK is unlike quite a lot of other countries, and the amount of data that's gathered about us is very, very broad, but we have a very, very broad population. We have a unique healthcare system that records a lot. We have a very, very broad base of people that live in the UK from all sorts of different ethnicities and all sorts of different backgrounds. So the data that's gathered about them is supremely valuable. And a lot of that value hasn't really been understood by government. But there is also an enormous risk that goes with that value, that it has to be completely anonymised, it has to be completely private, and you can't just sell it to anybody willy-nilly, because at some stage in the future, that could come back to bite you in a way that you're not happy about. So there are a lot of discussions around how the public data library, which is another part of the plan, is going to work. And the government has promised that safety and privacy will be at the absolute forefront of the way that library works and how that data will be shared with people and who it will be shared with. But so far at the moment, it's a promise. And if you're making a library like this one, you're going to say that, aren't you? You are going to promise and say, we're going to be really, really careful with how we handle this data and not just give it to anybody.
And also that's a good metaphor for this whole day, because if you look at that section of the government document today, there's 5-6 recommendations there. All of them are further details to be published by summer 2025. So today's been an announcement about having an announcement in a lot of it. Also, the thing that was mentioned about potholes, AI, I know it's a little bit of a joke, AI being used to help identify potholes sooner. It's not really an issue with identifying potholes sooner. Filling the potholes in is the issue. And that is also, it's a little bit of a, kind of analogy for what's going on here. Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go. Exit the Newscast studio. Thank you. And Chris, just as Mark goes out the studio, is Rachel Reeves going to be leaving number 11 Downing Street anytime soon?
No.
And that's the end of the podcast.
Yeah. It's funny, all this stuff. You've got... So, look, market wobbles often cause political wobbles. And you speak to some Labour folk who think, oh, crikey, it's all a bit bumpy, isn't it? It's all a bit negative, it's all a bit depressing. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, absolutely heart of the sort of Labour revitalisation. I know they said then, kind of, you know what I mean. Putting Labour back together over the last few years, and what you ended up having, and this is one of these classic of the genre Westminster moments. You had a few people asking Keir Starmer at his news conference whether or not he had full confidence in the Chancellor. That's a classic journalistic formulation when a minister is perceived to be in trouble. And ministers always have to say that they do when somebody is in the job, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't be in the job. But the questions were asked about whether or not the Chancellor would be the Chancellor until the next election, which could be 4.5 years away. And so many a Prime Minister might not want to answer that question with a definite yes, even if they think the Chancellor's going great guns and everything's absolutely fine. Anyway, he didn't quite say that. He said he had full confidence, but he didn't talk about the election and keeping her on until then. And then Downing Street had to clarify later this afternoon that he did mean that and that she would be around for the whole of the Parliament, etc., etc. I think what it ultimately gets to is, they're not wasting many smiles in government at the moment. It's a hard old slog. The economy's clearly in a bit of a mess. The borrowing stuff is difficult. It's a direct kind of market challenge, if you like, to the credibility of the Chancellor and her economic strategy, and therefore the Prime Minister's economic strategy. Hence, these questions get asked. I think if you take oh no, I said this last week, didn't I? Taking half a step back.
Well, since last week, we've now taken a full step back.
Let's take a full step back. Let's do that. Let's take a full step back. If you were the Chancellor, would you really want to walk away from doing this job right now? Because where would that leave your political kind of biography? I'd have thought the answer to that, however hard things are, would be no, you wouldn't. And if you were the Prime Minister who had remoulded people's images of your party around your choice for Chancellor, and there are market wobbles about the credibility of the government's approach to the economy, would your situation be helped or made worse by getting rid of the Chancellor? And I think the answer is the same as the first bit, which is that it would make things worse. So it's one of those things where there's been a whole lot of little blast of Westminster noise. As I say, there's something underneath it, which is that sort of sense that you pick up from Labour folk of a sort of a sense of gloom, a sense of just how hard governing is, etc., etc. But there's also I think a sort of splash of excitability there that it implies a sort of screaming headline that may not be entirely justified. But hey, if it's justified at some point, then that's when you write that headline, as opposed to at this point, I would have thought.
And Chris, it's been a joy to talk about the headlines with you today.
Ta-ra.
Now, one of the things that was in the AI master plan from the Prime Minister today was about rolling out the technology more widely in the public sector. And he started off his speech with an example of that, which is how AI is being used in a particular part of the NHS to deal with a particular condition, strokes. So I thought we would zoom in on that and then use that as an opportunity to zoom out and look at the whole AI phenomenon in the public sector. So we're going to do that now. And we're joined by a pair of experts. The first of them is Dr Maxine Mackintosh, who is an expert on AI and health. Hello, Dr Mackintosh.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And we're also joined by Sana Khareghani, who is former head of the UK Government Office for AI. Hello, Sana.
Hello, nice to be here.
And you were doing AI in the government until about, 2 and a bit years ago, Sana?
That's right, yeah. I left in 2022.
And I noticed one of your pinned tweets is about overseeing the then government's 10-year AI strategy. So the fact we've got another one 2 years later tells you all you need to know about the speed of the technology. But we'll have a more general conversation in a minute. But Maxine, I wanted to zoom in just on one particular issue, first of all, which is about AI and health. And Keir Starmer, when he started his speech today, talked about this project that uses AI to help spot where the blood clots are in the brain of people who've had strokes. Is that a project or a technology that you know anything about, that you've looked at?
So I'm not familiar with that exact example, but to be honest, a lot of these AI diagnostic systems work in very similar ways. So I'd be happy to describe it in general, because
go ahead.
Yeah, AI can sound like it's this kind of a freaky technology, and actually when you break it down into its constituent parts, it's actually not that scary. So in Keir Starmer's speech, he kind of talked about this woman, Deb Kelly, who came in with a suspected stroke. And when it comes to AI, it starts with a data set, kind of relevant information. That could be electronic health records, that could be imaging. Then that data tends to be processed in some way. It's cleaned up to make it less messy, because healthcare data is really messy. Then
messy in the sense of like everyone's so different and there might be errors in it, and so you've got to just tidy it up for the computer to learn from.
People will be diagnosed with stuff 15 years after they've died. People might be all sorts of different names. Data is inputted by humans, right? So it gets messy. So once you've got this slightly clean data set, then you can build these AI models on top of that data sets, and these models are quote unquote trained. And that just means that you develop statistical methods that read the data and then create some understanding of what that data or that story of that data is telling you. Then those models then spit out some sort of insight or some sort of decision, and that then tends to go to a professional that then assesses that decision and then takes an action on top of it. So in the case of Deb Kelly, she kind of was suspected of having a stroke. The doctors performed, I presume, a CT angiogram here to scan her brain for potential blockages. That scan would have then gone into a pool of lots of other scans of brains a bit like Deb Kelly's, and that AI would have looked at her scan and would have said, "Oh, we've seen scans a bit like this before, and we're able to see that actually there's a blockage in this specific area." And then based on that, the team were able to perform, I assume, a thrombectomy quite quickly. And that whole process would have taken about 3 to 4 minutes in terms of from scanning to detection. Now, humans can sometimes do that quite quickly, but the speed at which AI can do that is very, very impressive. And in the case of blood clots, often time is of the essence, and it really is a matter of life and death.
And is there something about the nature of, say, a blood clot on the brain that's causing a stroke that makes it particularly suited to be solved or have AI applied to it in a way that I imagine there's lots of medical conditions where actually it's not going to be applicable?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. So AI in healthcare particularly lends itself to imaging. Imaging is often one of the best use cases that we see for sort of low risk AI with high accuracy. Whereas if you, say, come into your GP and say, "Oh, I'm feeling a bit low, what can you do?" There's so much other data around that you need to understand. Why is someone low? What's their context? What's resulted in them being low? Should you be giving them some therapy? Should you be giving them a drug? Should you be asking follow-up questions? It's such a complicated scenario, just that notion of "I feel low." So compare that to seeing someone's brain in a scan, which can exist as an isolated piece of data. It lends itself quite easy to that focused AI.
And Sarna, with your ex-government hat on, how do you take that bit of technology that seems to be working very well for a particular condition, maybe only in a few hospitals? I'm not sure how widely rolled out it is. And how do you scale that up to the whole NHS? What things are you thinking about to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question about these technologies. Is not just that they work, and I think Maxine did such a great job of explaining. But the big question is, how do we put this across more NHS trusts, or across all of them, indeed? And that's the really difficult piece, because we tend to think of the NHS as one thing, but actually it isn't one massive thing that we can deal with in that way. It's a collection of trusts, and so each one of them has to go through the steps that they have set up in order to adopt these technologies, and for some it's easier than others. They have policies and governance, and the data is in the right shape to be able to adopt some of these things, and some of them have more work to do. So it does, we really can't look at the NHS as one end-to-end thing. It's a whole bunch of different trusts.
So Sana, does that mean that realistically we've got to accept the fact that some people, if they, we're fixating on this example of a stroke, but it is the one that the Prime Minister gave us. Some people in particular areas will benefit from this technology, where people living in other areas, it might be decades before it's applied to their brain in their particular emergency.
Well, I mean, I think that is what the AI action plan is trying to address, right? I think that this push to kind of drive adoption across the UK is trying to address this point, to say, we don't want to have certain areas that are further ahead than others, or certain areas that are doing this in pilot and not others. We want to try and push technologies that we know and trust and we know can work out much more across the whole of the NHS in this situation. But it could be, we could be talking about a different application, right? The potholes was the other kind of one that got spotlighted today. But whatever the application may be, I think the point of one of the points of the action plan is about adopting this more broadly across the UK. So that requires work, and it requires, a lining up and an agreement across the board.
And Maxine, just picking up on some of the things that Sana was saying there, are there more kind of concrete things that the Prime Minister has announced today, or at least pushed the button on today, that means that technology we were talking about, strokes, will be more widely available, more equally, perhaps more quickly than it was going to be, I don't know, last year?
So I think it's tricky because I think in the last few years about £300 million has gone into AI in the NHS, and there is certainly not the same level of improvement in concrete health outcomes that you would expect for that sort of investment. And he goes back to Sana's point that this is not an AI development problem, this is an AI adoption problem. For me, the analogy I like to use is that we keep pumping money into the AI bit. So imagine we are creating these ever flashy train carriages, and they've got kind of caviar on the train carriages, and you've got aircon, you've got swimming pools, and the carriages are getting flashier and flashier. We're not very good at linking the carriages to then produce trains, and those trains are then on train tracks that suddenly stop, and no one's there to work on the train tracks, and the train tracks can't withstand heat or cold. And so I sort of feel we're in a bit of that position when it comes to AI. A big piece for me is that we still haven't got the basics right. I was saying that 5 years ago. I was saying that 10 years ago. People who have been saying that for longer have been saying that for 20 years. That without kind of core skills, without the right compute, without looking at procurement interoperability, AI is fundamentally going to be limited in its adoption. And I think the action plan touches on a number of those things. So I guess I would make sure that we use the lighthouse of AI being the flashy, fancy thing that gets people excited, but really focus on the core infrastructural pieces, which is what the action plan leads with, and just really, really focus on those basics and getting those basics right.
Just a little sidebar here, Maxine. I've noticed the government mentioning a few times in the last few weeks the idea of using artificial intelligence to stop people missing appointments when they've got appointments at the hospital, are also to fill the gaps when people don't turn up for appointments. I mean, is that? It also seems like it seems a bit mad to be talking about that when we're also talking about this incredibly massive technological revolution, to link those two things together. But can you see a world where actually this technology is making the waiting list just much, much more efficient?
Absolutely. I mean, the NHS employs over 1 million people. So if everyone listening to this reflects on the size of the organisation they work for, 1 million is a huge number of people. And you think around the amount of software and processes and policies sitting within your organisations. The value add for reducing administrative burden and optimising processes is huge for the NHS. I guess what I would say, though, is that it's very important that those efficiency savings are then translated to health outcomes. And so say if you were to be able to save 20% of your resources within a specific area because you've reduced waiting times or you've reduced the do not attend rate, what are you going to do with that extra 20%? Are you going to target that towards people who, for example, do not have digital access, or for people for whom English is not their first language and therefore experience great barriers to care? Or are you going to reallocate that computer-liberated time to create more space for humanity and care between clinicians and patients? So I think there's huge benefit for efficiency savings because of the huge amount of admin that sits behind the NHS. But I also like to see how we're thoughtful about what we do with that extra capacity, and particularly how we create more space for humanity.
And Maxine, last question for you, and it's probably it's a tricky one to summarize, but I'm just struck by, we keep having this conversation about, at one point we're gonna have to have this conversation about how much of our health data we share with tech companies so that they can then build new applications that benefit us all. But it seems from talking to you today and listening to the Prime Minister about this stuff about strokes and blood clots, well, actually, loads of data's already gone in that direction. Has it?
Okay, this is a real favorite topic of mine, and I'm conscious of making this very succinct. So I guess there's a few things. One is we have to look at the risk of not doing it. So I think it's really, really important that we don't have a deficit model when looking at this. There's huge amounts of data there, and we, if we are obsessed with the risk of using it, we have to balance that with the risk of not using it. And that has to be handled within the context of patient privacy, trust in data, trust in use. But I think it's very important to recognise the risk of inaction. The second thing, I think there's a really important distinction between data, who owns the data and who has access to the data. So lots of people have access to your NHS data already without you. Some of those are individuals in private companies, some of them are individuals in research organizations, some of them are individuals in the NHS. Your data is being used all the time without your knowledge, sometimes for your direct care, sometimes to fuel research for people like you, and you might never benefit. So there's a real lack of awareness amongst the public about the fact that lots of data is being used already by lots of different actors. The thing that is important to recognize is that data that sits within the NHS is just one element of your health data. There's lots of health relevant data that sits around us all the time. And there was a really interesting survey done that showed that if you experience a health event, you give a search engine at least 4 data points about that health event. So it could be the symptoms of it, it could be how to take the medication, it could be the opening times of the clinic near you, and lots of other things around it. So be under no illusion that even though your health record might contain some quite sensitive information, you are constantly giving search engines, ChatGPT, Google, Bing, indicators that suggest you are experiencing a health condition or not. And that data is constantly being used by a range of different companies all over the place. So I think we're going to enter this world where what is healthcare data and what is health data, that boundary is getting very blurred, and it's already a very, very mixed market when it comes to whether it's the private sector or the public sector that's got access and use of it.
Fascinating. I went and got my annual blood pressure check at the high street chemist this afternoon, and I'm wondering who that data's winging its way to right now. Anyway, Maxine, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
And Sana, great to meet you too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.